think you should be speaking to customers all the time. Not so much every day, but every time you have something that's worth sharing. And I think you'll figure that out as you're building your product, if you've delivered something that's a big enough change to go back to them and ask them for feedback. One way that we keep customers engaged is ensuring that they feel like they're being a part of the journey. So we're not just sending out surveys going, hey, give us your data. We're explaining why we want that data. Previously we did some surveying around our funds. And when we sent the emails like, hey, look, we're looking to make improvements to the way that we do our funds. We were hoping that you could give some feedback so that we can use that in the improvements. And actually people appreciate that. They feel like they're being listened to, and if you share the results afterwards, they feel like, oh great, I'm a part of this thing. And if you follow up later on and say, hey, thanks for your feedback, we've now made these changes, they're like, wow, I am being listened to. And a lot of companies, feedback just goes into a pit, gets churned, analyzed, and used, and then the people who gave the feedback never really feel like they've made that difference. So I like to think, do feedback often, get surveys, talk to people regularly, and make them sure they know that their opinion and their thoughts are actually being used. Some of the common mistakes that I've made when doing MVPs is waiting too long to launch and just trying to add just one more feature. You get feedback and some people will say something like, oh, if only it did this or that, and you feel like you have to deliver that. And what happens is your launch just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And really what you should be doing is just launching after that kind of first round of feedback and getting more people looking at it and using it, and not being afraid that it might not be perfect. If you wait too long to launch, then you've spent a lot of time developing things that the real world may not actually appreciate and may never get used. When we did the development for the Trainline app, we had a feature in it which was like tweet my journey and see who else is on the train. And we spent, I don't know, maybe a week, might have been 2 weeks, building that feature because someone said in the feedback, oh, it'd be interesting if I could see who else is on my train. I think in the 6 months that it was actually a feature in the live app, maybe 20 people used it. And we spent a whole 2 weeks just on that feature. And it was like, damn, we should have just scrapped that. We should have said, yeah, maybe add it after launch, but we waited for it and then we launched with it and then it never got used. And if you calculated the cost back then of 2 weeks of development in an iPhone app, it would have been thousands and thousands of pounds because things weren't easy then. When we could have just avoided it and surveyed people later on to see if, would you use this? So yeah, waiting too long is probably the biggest one. You don't need to allocate budget, but you do need to allocate sufficient time. So there are a number of tools out there that offer startups free use, free limited use, which you can use to test the MVP. Things like Unbounce, things like 5-second test. I think even Validately has a free version for a certain number of tests. So things where you can go out to the market. You don't even have to have the app. You can just have like a PDF of the homepage, and you can get people's opinion on what you're doing free. Or you can take them through a couple of pages in your sign-up process or your buying process and see if they can actually use it before you go on to design the actual site or application. So you don't necessarily need budget, and you can always paper prototype things like we did for our first version of the app and take them to where your customers are likely to be and just ask people, hey, will you test this for a few minutes? In a lot of co-working spaces, you'll see that in WeWork and Tech Hub and others, where people who are working on something will go and ask some other entrepreneurs, hey, can you give some feedback on this thing that we're doing? And it might be a printout or it might be a beta of the app, but they do that, and sometimes they'll bring candy bars and be like, hey, look, if you do this, we'll give you a candy bar or whatever it is that they give them, or some swag. So yeah, you don't really need a budget or a big budget to test it. Going back to kind of what I said earlier on, a good process is to do a paper prototype, take it to some people that you've never seen before, or if you can mock something up real quick in an app, in a test app, take it to people that you don't know, see what they think. Hopefully they're in your target demographic, so do some segmentation and just see what they say. That's step one. If you go to friends and family, they'll be like, yeah, this is great. It may be great, it might not, you'll never know. So yeah, put things together, paper prototype, do a beta app, get some people, some real world users to test it, use a tool like Unbounce, Validately, or some of the others that are out there. And then once you've got that first feedback, then take that on board, prioritize. If one person said it'd be great to do this, okay, you don't necessarily have to do that. If 5 people say, hey, we really think it's missing this, maybe you should make that change. Once you've got those changes prioritized, knock them out, redo the prototype, send it back out to new people, and once you're happy that enough people think it's good, then maybe do a soft launch to the real world. I do think that founders should rely on one person to determine product market fit. And the reason for that is if you go much beyond that, you start to bring in a lot of opinion. And when you have a lot of opinion, it sometimes overrules data. So really, you should have one person who's a very data-oriented individual who can test things, get the information, and then present it saying, yep, we tested this, this, and that, and here's what the data said. Founders are very possessive of the products, and oftentimes they fall in love with the product or the vision that they have for it. Unfortunately, emotion can sometimes get in the way of data and findings and maybe steer the product in a direction that wastes time and development effort that it shouldn't have done. So yeah, find someone who's very to the line with data and let them guide where the product goes. You should definitely have a vision of where the product's going, but within, that vision is bigger picture, and how you get to that product should be steered by what the users are telling you and what the data is saying. Oftentimes what happens is you've got a vision and you also think that you know how to get there, and it's got to be like this. But actually, a lot of times developing a product is kind of zigging and zagging and going, figure this out, okay, now we'll develop it like this, and now the users are telling us that we should be doing this, so we'll kind of do that. I'm not talking about pivoting, I'm talking about features that you add, pricing structures. You can get a lot of that from your users if you do the right tests. So you don't have to think like, here's our vision and it's just like this to get there. You might wind your way up there, but as long as you've got someone who's actually listening to the customer, you won't go wrong because you're doing what they want you to do, as opposed to something that you think you should be doing. When you've got a lot of chefs in the kitchen, the best thing you can do is just to test the opinions as hypotheses. So, if someone says, oh, I think this, then figure out how you can test that. And of course, be open to the answer not being what you want it to be. I think very early on at SyndicateRoom, we did have a lot of opinions about things. And to be quite frank, some of those opinions took us in directions that we shouldn't have gone. And we spent time developing products that people didn't want. There's a human cost to that, there's a monetary cost to that, there's a morale cost to that because you've worked so hard on something you think is going to be great. But really, we should have spent more time surveying and questioning people if they thought it was a good idea, not just listen to the first impression of, yeah, that sounds good, and there could be some money to be made there, let's do it. So when you have people with opinions, before you start to go down that road, figure out how you can test it, and kill the idea if it's not going to work out, if people say no. Yeah, look, people get emotionally attached to ideas all the time. The thing is, you need to make sure that you have people in the room who can listen to the data and be willing to say, look, I got it wrong. And if people can't say I got it wrong, then you probably shouldn't be entrepreneurs, because a lot about being an entrepreneur is getting it wrong, learning from it, going on.